You don't belong here. Old man, this is for real veterans. Those were the words that cut through the December air as Walter Jennings, 88, stood shivering in his worn army jacket, a folded American flag clutched tightly to his chest. The security guard barely looked up, while a few nearby onlookers chuckled and turned away. Walter didn't argue, didn't shout. He simply turned and walked back into the cold, his pride intact, but his spirit bruised. He had come to the National Veterans Museum for Pearl Harbor Remembrance Day, a place meant to honor men like him, men who had fought in Korea and advised troops in Vietnam. He'd woken before dawn, taken 3 buses, polished his boots, and pinned a bronze star to his chest, not for attention, but out of quiet respect. But none of that mattered, not without an official ID. What the museum staff didn't know was that this quiet old man, dismissed as just another drifter, once saved lives under enemy fire. That he had bled for his country. That the folded flag in his arms had once draped his brother's coffin. And what they also didn't know was that someone had noticed. Just 30 minutes later, a convoy of black SUVs pulled up. A 4-star general named Marcus Callahan stepped into the building and asked a single question that silenced the room. Where is the man you just humiliated? Because in that moment, the museum stopped honoring veterans in theory and started doing it for real. For most people, December 7th was just another date on the calendar. But for Walter Jennings, it was sacred. A day to remember not just Pearl Harbor, but all who wore the uniform, especially the ones who never made it home. At 88, Walter was one of the few left from his unit. He didn't walk fast anymore. His hands trembled. His jacket was faded and his boots scuffed. But his memory, especially of service, was sharp as ever. He had been a young radio man in the 38th Infantry during Korea. Later, he served as a Special Forces advisor in Vietnam. He had witnessed horrors, bravery, and brotherhood that civilians could never understand. He had carried wounded friends to helicopters, translated garbled code under fire, and once held the line for 18 hours with nothing but a field radio and a sidearm. Now, decades later, Walter lived quietly in a small apartment on the edge of town. He kept his medals in a shoebox beneath his bed and volunteered at the local VFW twice a week. When he learned that the National Veterans Museum was holding a special Pearl Harbor Remembrance ceremony, he circled the date on his calendar with shaky hands. He didn't ask for a ride. He didn't want to trouble his granddaughter. This was a journey he felt he had to take alone. The trip required 3 buses, each with long transfers and winter wind that bit into his thin frame. He arrived early, boots polished, bronze star pinned carefully to his jacket, and a folded flag in his arms. It was the same flag that had covered his brother's casket after he died in Korea. But all of that meant nothing to the young security guard at the entrance. No ID, no VA card, no entry. The guard said flatly. We can't let just anyone claim they're a veteran. Walter offered a photo himself in uniform, standing proudly among his unit. It was dismissed with a glance. That could be anyone. And just like that, Walter was turned away from the very place built to honor men like him. No one noticed when he walked back down the steps and sat quietly on a bench. No one except a woman across the street, who had witnessed the entire exchange and made a phone call that would change everything. Because sometimes the uniform fades, the records disappear, but the dignity of a soldier never leaves him. And even when the world forgets, someone always remembers. Inside the grand marble halls of the National Veterans Museum, the air was filled with music and applause. Speeches echoed across tall ceilings. Words like sacrifice, service, and duty poured from the podium. Children sang patriotic songs while families captured every moment on their phones. But just beyond those doors, on a cold stone bench dusted with December snow, Walter Jennings, 88, sat clutching a folded American flag to his chest, the same flag that had once draped his brother's coffin. Only an hour earlier, he had arrived in his best pressed army jacket and polished boots. He didn't look like the photos on the museum banners. His steps were slow. His hands trembled. He didn't carry a VA card or a modern military ID, just a faded photograph, and the quiet dignity of a man who had served when it was hardest. Not most convenient, And for that, he was told, "You don't belong here." Old man, but someone was listening. Across town, General Marcus Callahan, a four-star officer and decorated veteran himself, had just received a briefing from one of his colonels. When he heard the name Walter Jennings, he froze. That was the man who had saved his father's life in Korea, pulling him from a burning tank under fire, suffering severe burns himself in the process. 5 minutes later, a black SUV convoy tore through the streets with sirens off, but purpose blazing. General Callahan, dressed in full-service uniform, marched through the museum entrance like a storm. He didn't shake hands. He didn't smile. He asked only one thing. "Where is the man you just humiliated?" The security guard stammered. The museum director paled. Visitors stopped mid-sentence. Cameras turned. The words hung in the air like a verdict. "You had a hero on your steps," Callahan said, his voice carrying through the marble halls. "And you turned him away because he didn't fit your image of a veteran." He didn't wait for answers. He went out the doors himself, crossed the plaza, and found Walter still sitting in silence. Flag in hand, Callahan snapped to attention and rendered a crisp salute. "Master Sergeant Jennings," he said firmly, "you saved my father's life. It is my honor to escort you back in." Walter blinked, then slowly rose. Together, the two men walked up the same steps that had once rejected him. This time, the guards stood aside. Staff lowered their heads. Reporters followed. Guests stood and clapped. Because now, they weren't just honoring a symbol, they were honoring a man. A man whose name had almost been forgotten, whose sacrifices had almost been overlooked, but whose worth had never diminished. What began as a quiet injustice on a cold December morning soon erupted into a national reckoning. When 88-year-old Walter Jennings was turned away from the National Veterans Museum for not carrying modern ID, despite his decades of decorated military service, the moment passed without protest. No one inside noticed the old man walking back down the steps. No one paused the ceremony being held in honor of men like him. But that silence didn't last long. The confrontation that followed, led by General Marcus Callahan, who personally escorted Walter back into the museum, was captured by multiple onlookers and shared online within hours. Video showed the general's voice echoing through the marble atrium. "You had a Medal of Honor nominee standing on your steps, and you locked the door in his face." That line hit a nerve. By morning, the clip had been viewed over 6 million times. News anchors replayed it with solemn commentary. Social media exploded with hashtags like "Honor All Veterans" and "No ED, No Entry." Veterans groups issued public statements. People across the country began asking themselves the hard question: how many times have we looked away from someone who deserved to be seen? The museum director resigned within 48 hours. The security guard issued a public apology and was reassigned. But the impact went far beyond the walls of one institution. Within a week, the museum board announced sweeping reforms. All self-identified veterans would now be welcomed, regardless of documentation. Every staff member would undergo training in empathy and recognition. A new wing called the Forgotten Warriors exhibit would be open, dedicated to veterans often overlooked due to age, appearance, or circumstance. And at the center of that new wing, Walter Jennings was asked to cut the ribbon. He didn't want the spotlight. "There are thousands like me," he said quietly. "You just don't see them on posters." But he stood tall that day, his old jacket buttoned, boots polished once again, not as a man seeking recognition, but as a reminder that true honor isn't about medals, but memory. That respect is not earned in paper, but in sacrifice. Perhaps the most meaningful tribute came in the form of a simple wooden bench installed just outside the museum's entrance. It bore no advertisement, no sponsorship, only a bronze plaque that read, "Reserved for those who served." And an unspoken rule followed. No one sat there if a veteran was standing. Walter was seen sitting near it every Sunday after that, sometimes alone, sometimes talking with curious children or younger vets. But never again was he invisible. He had become a living reminder of the lesson etched into the country's conscience. We don't honor service with words, we honor it with action. After the viral clip of General Marcus Callahan saluting Walter Jennings swept across social media, something changed, not just in policy or in headlines, but in people. They saw an old man in a worn jacket, sitting quietly with a folded flag in his arms. They saw him turned away from a museum built to honor people like him, and then they saw a four-star general show up, not for publicity, not for politics, but because he remembered, because Walter had once dragged his father from a burning tank under enemy fire and never asked for thanks. The story could have ended with the apology, with the museum's reforms, with the ribbon cutting and the headlines, but it didn't, because what truly mattered wasn't what Walter received, it was what he represented. Every Sunday afternoon, weather permitting, Walter could be found near the bench outside the museum, the one with the bronze plaque that read, "Reserved for those who served." He never sat there alone. Children came to ask about the medals. Young veterans came just to listen. And even civilians, people with no military ties, stopped by just to say thank you. They came not for history, but for presence. Because Walter wasn't a symbol, he was a bridge between eras. A living reminder that service doesn't end with discharge. That respect shouldn't come with conditions. And that some uniforms may fade, but their meaning never should. He never raised his voice. He never asked for recognition. He simply stood his ground with humility, patience, and quiet strength. And in doing so, he taught an entire generation something priceless, that the way we treat the seemingly ordinary people among us says everything about who we really are. Polished boots, a faded army jacket, and a tightly folded American flag in his arms, the same flag that had once draped his brother's coffin after the Korean War. He had no modern military ID, no digital documentation, only an old wartime photograph and a pride that never faded. And for that, he was denied entry. He didn't get angry. He didn't protest. He simply stepped away in silence, descending the grand steps of a building that had been created to honor those who served. What the people inside didn't know was that Mr. Walter Jennings had once saved the life of the father of one of the most powerful generals alive today. And just hours later, the entire country knew his name. After a video of General Marcus Callahan arriving at the museum and demanding that Mr. Jennings be brought inside spread rapidly online, a wave of sympathy and awakening swept across the nation. It wasn't just outrage at injustice. It was a collective sense of shame. A realization, we've become too used to honoring the symbol of a veteran and forgetting the real people behind the image. Letters of gratitude poured in. Veteran organizations saw volunteer numbers double in just 1 week. Schools began requesting older veterans to speak to students, and at the museum, a new section was created, the Silent Service Wing, dedicated to honoring veterans who had been forgotten because of age, circumstance, or simply because they didn't fit the standard image. But what moved Walter Jennings most wasn't the praise. It was a simple wooden bench, placed right outside the museum's main entrance, with a small bronze plaque that read, "Reserved for those who served." And from that day on, Walter was never seen sitting alone again. Children sat beside him to hear his stories. Younger veterans came by to shake his hand and learn. Even casual tourists paused, hands over their hearts. As they walked past him, he was no longer the old man without papers. He had become a living symbol, a reminder that respect isn't found in documents, but in the heart. The story of Walter Jennings is more than just a reminder to respect our veterans. It's a mirror reflecting how we perceive human worth in today's society, where honor and true service are often overshadowed by appearances, age, or shallow expectations. Walter never asked for applause. He only wanted to be seen, to be acknowledged as a man who had sacrificed for his country. And the moment the entire room rose to their feet as he walked in, led by a four-star general, proved that respect doesn't come from ceremony, but from awakening, from someone quietly turned away. He became a living symbol of dignity. And we, the witnesses to that moment, were forced to reflect on ourselves. How many times have we unknowingly walked past a silent hero